Is this going to be a turning point about something better to come? Mr. Walsh, your assessment.
Well, I think it will definitely be a victory for the Syrian government. It comes at a high cost. They have essentially, as they used to say about Vietnam, burned the village in order to save it. They've destroyed the city and they've committed war crimes, but it's still a military victory. But as for its long-term implications, you know, all those rebels aren't going away. ISIL or Daesh is not going away. And the fundamental political reasons why there's a conflict in the first place, they all remain. And if the Russians and the Iranians were to pull out, Assad would begin losing again. So I don't see this, I don't see the fighting stopping, and I don't see this being a stable or a peaceful country until the underlying political causes are addressed.
Mr. Babich, is this a turning point? Is it going to be better after this, or ever worse, as Mr. Walsh seemed to mention?
Well, I think it will depend not so much on the Syrian government or on Russia or on Iran. It will depend on the West and on the Gulf monarchies, probably also on Turkey. Will they stop supporting the radical opposition to Mr. Assad? Because I can't call the moderates the people who took up arms and who take part in an armed uprising. What I would like to mention here is that even on the BBC today, you could see there are buses taking the rebels out of the city. The buses provided by the government. The rebels, as Mr. Walsh rightly said, they are not exterminated. They are taken to the territories controlled by other rebels. So this is a kind of treatment that the pro-government forces did not feel when the rebels took one city after another since the beginning of the civil war in 2011. Wow. There were no buses for government officials, for teachers, for doctors who were destroyed by the Islamist rebels in the areas controlled by Daesh, controlled by Jabhat al-Nusra and other enemies of the Syrian government.
So what you're suggesting that Russia has been doing a very good job in terms of negotiating with the opposition. Is that what you're saying? Or are you saying the Assad regime actually have been providing the rebels with another way out, and that is going to create certain kind of good feelings between the two sides? I'm
just telling you what BBC said. You can see by these images that, of course, every civil war is cruel, and you can't say that anyone is doing a good job during the civil war. There are always terrible cruelties committed. Okay. But there is a big difference between the Syrian government and the armed insurgents. The Syrian government is giving them a way out. It agrees to ceasefires. While the rebels, they pulled out of the talks in Geneva. They executed the soldiers who were taken as POWs. If you look at the foreign journalists who were held hostage in Syria, people like Matthew Schreier from the United States or Chirico from Italy, they were never held by the Syrian government. They were all held by the so-called opposition. Okay. So what I'm suggesting is that, of course, it's a cruel civil war, but you can see who is more cruel at the example of Aleppo.
Well, they might see who is cruel or not from what you have just described, but certainly we have seen who is on which side, as you have just described. Mr. Walsh, therefore, I want you to come back and comment about that. Is this a turning point for Syria? Is this a turning point for Syria? Or this is rather a turning point about Russia-U.S. relations or Russia-the West relations, fundamentally speaking?
I don't think the military victory is going to represent a turning point in the war. I do think there is political change, obviously. Turkey is shifting its position on the Syrian conflict. It sounds like the U.S. may be shifting its position, but it was never very deeply involved to begin with. President Obama was continually criticized for not doing more in Syria. So basically only airstrikes, and it sounds like there's a possibility that those airstrikes will end, but you know, we'll have to wait and see. But you know, this notion that the Syrian government is the good guys is absurd, And one should be ashamed to make that argument. It was the Syrian government that used chemical weapons. It was the Russians who bombed hospitals. It was the Syrians who summarily executed people in Aleppo, according to the UN, and on and on. The reason why we have this war to begin with is we have a dictator who inherited power from his father, not in an election, who had been a dictator who slaughtered peaceful protesters.
Well, you see,
that's what gave rise to extremism, and yes, there are terrorists. Yes, but to say that the Syrian government has clean hands is ridiculous.
Ms. He, you could see there are ill feelings from both sides toward one another.
I didn't say it. You are lying when you say I said it. I didn't say they had clean hands. You are lying as usual.
Okay. We see very emotional response coming from both sides. Certainly there are ill feelings coming from both sides, to say the least. So what are we talking about when we talk about both sides? So maybe on the one side, possibly, Syria government, Russia at this moment, and some of the other countries who do not want to see more civil war inside Syria. And on the other hand, the opposition, maybe the United States, some of the Western countries. And of course, there are other factors, ISIL and many others. And meanwhile, there are Arab countries such as Qatar, Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, there's the issue of Turkey. They all take their stance. It's complicated, as we always mention, but Ms. He, fundamentally, do you think things will be able to come to an easier ending or pause? Because what? Because of the government vis-a-vis opposition, or because of the big power relations come to an easing point at this moment?
Well, given the big context that is in the White House, they will have a new president there. And also, it seems to be that the relations between this United States next year, when the Trump will be becoming the president, and with the Russia President Putin, they're going to be a good relations, I think. They both want to open a new chapter between US and Russia. So these big players, I think now they are going to change their strategy. That's why this Aleppo will be taken away, especially by the end of this year. Because I think this is one of the strategies the Russian President Putin has made. Because before there's a new president in the White House, and then he wants to end it, those fighting issues in the Aleppo, and then make these things back on the negotiation track again. So that will becoming even a new signal, a good signal message sent to the coming US President Trump. So we are going to see a new chapter as well about the Aleppo, about not only Aleppo issue, about the Syria crisis. I think this is a turning point. I can agree with that. And also not only the military meaning, also the political meaning and the diplomatic meaning. Now you see all those players, they are all echo those ideas, saying now we need to talk this issue. No more fighting, and then it's the best time for negotiation. Even the US and the France and the UK and even the Gulf countries, they all agree. And then they join the meeting in Paris. They all say now it's the time for
What
talking.
does that mean to you?
That means now the military, they feel so frustrated. I mean, from that camp, they think it's no hope.
Something has to come to an end. At this moment, Mr. Walsh, of course, your president-elect, Mr. Trump, is still not in the office until the 20th of January. And yet, during his campaign, he has expressed some good feelings toward the Russian president. And he has also been talking about Syria issue as he sees it. In fact, against what the vice president, who belonged to the quote-unquote the Republican establishment, suggested about airstrike, he said, no, I don't think that should happen. So what is likely to be the weight of the issue of Syria for the overall diplomatic blueprint of this new president-elect, who is, of course, being described at least with a lot of very different personality, if not temperament?
Yes, yes. Well, it's a great question. We'll find out, in 6 months. I do agree with your analysis, though, that during the campaign, he seemed to emphasize two things, that he wanted to go after Daesh and that he had all these wonderful words for Mr. Putin. So I would expect, in general, you would expect that he'll have a new policy in Syria that is more supportive of the Russian position. But as you also point out, there are going to be a lot of people in his cabinet who have a very different point of view, who feel, who have more anti-Russian points of view and have views about what's happening in Syria. Ultimately, though, the president decides national security policy, and I think he'll get what he wants. Let me end by saying that I want to politely disagree with my colleague in China by saying, you know, I hope that they come to a political settlement. It would be great if this war would end. But it's not the great powers that are going to determine that. It's the people on the ground. Right. You know, France and Britain and Russia, they can do everything they want. The United States can take it. But it's the Syrians and the Syrian government who are shooting at each other. That will determine whether the conflict continues or ends. I don't see them coming to a political compromise.
Well, we're going to that layer of discussion a bit later. Of course, it's a very complicated question. A lot of factors are zooming in on this specific conflict. Mr. Babich, same question to you about the new coming in president-elect, Mr. Trump, relation with Russia. How much of that, in a way, weighs in the consideration at this point in Moscow about what to do with Syria and what to do with Aleppo? Is it going to be a gift, diplomatic gift, President Putin give, at least temporarily, to his American counterpart to be?
Well, I would say that in Moscow there are, of course, different points of view. There are some people who are very optimistic about President-elect Donald Trump and his new Secretary of State. But the prevailing view is more skeptical. I think that the problem in the United States is not with President Obama or President George Bush Jr., who destroyed whole countries when they were in power, such as Libya, such as Iraq. The problem is with the ideology which is now predominant in the United States and in the European Union. That is the ideology of regime change. These people think that they have the right to determine which countries are dictatorship and need to be reformed, which countries are democracies. And Syria is the first situation when their machine didn't work, when they quite openly wanted to change the government there by applying pressure from outside. I politely disagree with Jim Walsh. First, when he says that I presented the Syrian government as the good guy with clean hands, I didn't say it. Second, when he said that the United States did not get involved in Syria. I'm sorry, the former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, proposed paying salaries to the Syrian soldiers if they desert the army. Can you imagine what would happen to any diplomat who would say he would pay American GIs if they stop defending the United States? So I think that in Syria, for the first time, the ideological machine of regime change didn't work, and that's a reassuring sign. Let's hope the new president will take it into consideration.
Mr. Babich, I want you to briefly respond to my question, which is to follow up what you have just said. In fact, it is not just the president-elect, Mr. Trump, who have been talking about not using force, not using regime change. President Obama himself has been talking about it throughout his presidency, withdrawing from some of the countries. There were wars, America participated or started it. And also in Syria, the US has been very limiting its on-ground presentation over there, to say the least. So from Russia's perspective, you earlier described very interestingly using the word cautious about the incoming president. How much do you think, from Russia's perspective, really is there going to be dramatic change from what President Obama now has in mind and been practicing to President Donald Trump, President-elect Donald Trump, when he comes into power on the issue of Syria? Really, some real assessment here, Mr. Babich, please.
I think I hope that the American policy on Syria will change, but it won't depend on Trump alone. It will depend on the general atmosphere, the decision, if you want, of the American people and the American elite, and also of the European elite. You are right that Mr. Obama said he didn't pursue regime change, but it was amazing how John Kerry, his Secretary of State, on the same day said, we don't insist on Assad leaving power, and then on the same day in the evening he said Assad must go. How many times did we hear from John Kerry, Assad must go?
Okay.
If that is not regime change, then what is?
All right,
so
then.
Mr. Obama has been very duplicitous during his stay in power, and I hope this duplicity will not continue with Mr. Trump.
I see. Ms. He here in Beijing, how should we understand this? I mean, at this point, critical juncture, Aleppo apparently heading for better. But how much it will continue? How much will have to do with what Mr. Babich said, the general atmosphere inside Washington after Mr. Trump comes into power? How much will that have to do with the chemistry between Moscow and Washington, D.C.?
I think very obviously we will see two kinds of phenomena will proceeding on the same time. One track is that the fighting will continue, because even though the Aleppo has been retaken by the Syria government, but we see now even recent days that another big city, Papillon, has been retaken by the ISIL.
Yes,
so,
and the evacuation has not been a very easy process, to say the least, in Aleppo.
Yeah, so that's one track. The fighting will continue, and then all the civil war will be there, so not end yet. Another track also now will be resumed. That's the negotiation track. That track has been suspended for a number of months.
Right.
But now, because of those Aleppo, retaken, and then obviously now the Syria government forces has been, gaining the upper hand. So that's the fact. Now all those big cities in Syria now is in the hand of Syria government.
Right.
So there's no other way to get a breakthrough, especially give this critical juncture that the new government will be sworn in very soon. So now another track is negotiation. So two tracks will moving forward simultaneously. So we will see now, from time to time,
on both sides as well.
Right.
Mr. Walsh, you earlier talked about the new cabinet members. I do want to go a little bit in detail about that, because those are very important. The Secretary of State, of course, at this moment is Mr. Rex Tillerson. He is rather being described as closer relationship with Russia, being able to communicate with President Putin. However, the Defense Secretary has been traditionally a civilian, and yet this time it is a general. As we understand, the American Army is not necessarily very friendly toward Moscow to begin with. So, how are we going to see the inside fighting within the administration itself and eventually cast its shadow on whatever policy Mr. Trump administration might have?
Well, I think it's a good question. Obviously, all these names are people who have to be confirmed. I think most of them will be confirmed, but certainly some will not be confirmed. Of particular importance will be his national security team. Mr. Flynn, who I have grave doubts about, and Ms. McFarland, who I'm not impressed by. But even within the Department of State, it's right to say that the designee has been reported as having strong relations with Mr. Putin, but the number two person who's allegedly going to be the second in command, Mr. Bolton, is an unreconstructed neocon hawk who wants to bomb Iran and bomb a bunch of countries. So, there'll be infighting, all right, and it's not going to be just between the State Department and the Department of Defense. It's going to be within the State Department, in the White House, between between advisors who are trying to win Mr. Trump's favor. So I think that's going to be a very important thing to watch moving forward. And I think, frankly, Mr. Trump is not a grand strategist. He himself has said he's a counterpuncher. So he's much more likely to react to things than he is to set a broad vision.